we're familiar with square roots, and we understand that the square root of 4 has to be 2, because 2 squared is equal to 4. You could tell me that the square root of 9 would have to be 3, because 3 squared is 9. What if I were to ask you about the square root of negative 4? Well, here we run into a little bit of a problem, because thinking about what number squares to give us the answer negative 4, well, it's not 2, because 2 squared is positive 4, and it's not negative 2 either, because negative 2 squared is also positive 4. We run into the problem that there is no number that we know of that we can multiply by itself that will give us a negative 4. The same would be the case for the square root of negative 9. 3 squared would be positive 9. Negative 3 squared would also be positive 9. So we don't know of any number that we could multiply by itself or that we could square to give us a negative 9. So up until this point, you have probably been told that you cannot take the square root of a negative number. Well, the square root of a negative number is not a real number, which is why you've been told that. However, there are applications much later on in math that require that we actually be able to take the square root of a negative number. So we deal with this by creating something called an imaginary number. The imaginary number is by definition the square root of negative 1. It's imaginary because it's not real. It's not a number that you see on the number line. It's not one that you've ever worked with before or that you can actually find. But the imaginary number is defined to be the square root of negative 1. We call this number I. Now that we know the square root of negative 1 is this imaginary number, I, we can take the square root of negative 4. We know that negative 4 is the same thing as negative 1 times 4. Well, you know that the square root of 4 is 2, and we now know that the square root of negative 1 is I. So since the square root of 4 is 2 and the square root of negative 1 is I, the square root of negative 4 would have to be 2I. The same idea with the square root of negative 9. That's the same thing as negative 1 times 9. So the square root of 9 would be 3. The square root of negative 1 is I, so the square root of negative 9 would have to be 3I. Keep in mind that a negative outside the radical is not the same thing. For example, if we had the negative square root of 4, that's simply the square root of 4. Take your answer and make it negative. So this would be the number negative 2. It is not imaginary because that radical did not have a negative underneath it. We did not have a negative radicand. So this particular radical does not give us an imaginary answer. It gives us a real answer. However, the negative square root of negative 4 would be a different case. That would be negative square root of negative 1 times 4. Well, we know the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of negative 1 is I. And we have this negative outside that has to be dealt with. So we have the negative of our answer. So the negative square root of negative 4 would be negative 2I. This is an imaginary answer because the negative was in the radicand. It was underneath that radical.